Liam serves as the chair of the Independent Monitoring Board of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, a panel credited with helping improve management of the often unwieldy global polio eradication apparatus. Sir Liam is recognized as an international champion of patient safety and public health, providing leadership for the World Health Organization World Alliance for Patient Safety, and is past vice chairman of the WHO Executive Board. He now serves as WHO's envoy for patient safety, and in the UK sits as chair of health policy at Imperial College London and chancellor of Newcastle University. He previously served as chief medical officer for England. Please welcome Sir Liam Donaldson.
Good afternoon, diners. The year, 1977. The place, the lobby of the Pan American Health Organization building here in Washington, D.C. A young man of humble demeanor stands holding a cocktail in the pre-dinner session of the health ministers' meeting at PAHO that year. He's approached by an older man, and the older man points to the button that he has on his lapel. And the button is the symbol of the smallpox eradication program, the bifurcated needle. And the older man says to the young man, "Never again. Never again," he said. "Never again will such a program be promoted by the World Health Organization." The young man, of course, was Dr. Ciro de Quadros, a legendary figure in the field of vaccination, and I was privileged to have him as a member of my board and got to know him as a colleague and a friend, and he's still greatly missed. The older man was Hafton Mahler, the Director General of the World Health Organization. Mahler's view was very strong, and indeed, in 1975, he'd written a paper jointly with the head of UNICEF on primary care, and there were two fundamental points in that. One, a fierce criticism of vertical programs, and secondly, the notion that Western approaches could not be imposed on developing countries. From that time to 11 years later, the WHO did launch an eradication program for another disease, and that disease, of course, is why we're here today, polio. The precise history of why that happened is beyond the time that we've got available today, and as historians will tell you, there are many versions of history. But one of the key factors, I think, in driving that change of policy was the success of the Universal Childhood Immunization Program in the Americas. And Dr. de Quadros's view that as part of that overall program, there should be a banner disease, as he called it, and that banner disease would be polio. And then secondly, of course, crucially, the choice of Rotary International to raise funds to make polio their initiative above any other. And as we heard from Dr. Frieden this morning, polio eradication was initially a success story, 350,000 cases, down at the end of the 1990s to 1% of that original total. Then it started to flatline, and the program's narrative was in contrast to that flatlining. There was talk about being this close, nearly there, success being within touching distance. It was almost like some of the soccer coaches in the UK who stand before the cameras where their team is right down in the league table in the standings and tell the media, well, we may not have that many points, but this is not our real position in the league. And the old sports cliche that the table doesn't lie. Well, there was an element of magical thinking in the sports coaching world, there always is, but I think there was an element of magical thinking in the polio eradication program at that time. After a tremendous success, the flatlining was really regarded as something which was temporary, and if everybody tried harder and continued to spend the large sums of money that were being given, then eventually the corner would be turned. That's where the IMB, the Independent Monitoring Board, which I was asked to chair, came in. There hadn't been such a board before. At the time we came in, there were 4 endemic countries, 3 countries in which polio had been reintroduced, Angola, Chad, and DR Congo, and there had been 16 outbreaks in different countries in the year before we were established. And I think insofar as there was an expectation about what this new body would do, there was a very broad terms of reference that we were meant to monitor and pass judgments on the strategic plan and the deadlines contained in it. The expectation seemed to be that our meetings would be small scale, our reports would be brief, and that they would be generally a statistical digest of the epidemiology of the program. Instead, we embarked on an analysis really driven by trying to understand why the program was failing. It may be a harsh word to use about the program failing, and it was indeed an affront when I used that word to those who were leading the program at the time. They disputed strongly that they were failing, but of course we come back to this flatlining situation. Of course, we acknowledge the past successes, as I've said, but the challenges were those of the present. And to us, at that time, the present did not look good. And we were not confident that the program could eradicate polio working in the way that it did at the time. There's an old adage in the quality improvement world, and it's an area that I've studied greatly in my work on healthcare quality and safety, and that is every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. So the results that the program was getting at the time were as a result of a perfectly designed system to produce those results. Now, that may seem a simplistic thing to say, but actually it's also quite profound, and really the only answer to break the deadlock or the grip that the poliovirus had still on everybody was to do something to change the system. System is a bit of jargon, of course. It encompasses a range of things from procedures to processes to ways of working to organizational design, all sorts of things. But a system is a system, if that doesn't sound too much like Yogi Berra. Most of you are familiar with our series of reports, the things we've said, the action we've prompted. So for the rest of my presentation, I want to make some strategic reflections on why I think that global programs function the way they do and how they can be judged. First of all, in my view, there are features common to many global programs that mean that it's very difficult for them to judge themselves, to judge their own performance. They need some degree of external judgment, even though they may have board structures or governance structures which provide a degree of independence within their framework. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, just here are the features of many global programs. First of all, their partnerships, their grouping or linkages between different individual organizations, and each of those component organizations have their own hierarchies, their own subcultures, their own silos. So the expectation of a partnership is that somehow all of those different strands and different cultures will be melded together to create a single entity. And that's a very, very difficult, if not impossible, thing to do. That almost doesn't matter if everybody recognizes that that is the situation and that they have to take account of that in the way they work together. But often partnerships don't do that. They don't have those open discussions about, and they don't exchange staff and learn about each other's cultures. They don't do the simple things that would help a lot to that extent. The second thing about a partnership is that each of the partner organizations will usually have more than one objective. They'll have the common objective for which the partnership is about, in this case, polio eradication, but they'll also have secondary objectives of their own. And sometimes those secondary objectives will detract or even conflict with the primary objective. So, for example, WHO and UNICEF, as UN agencies, have the objective of eradicating polio, but they also have to take account of the relationship that they have with their member states. They have to retain a degree of deference to their member states in order to stay in their posts or not cause uproar within the organizations. And that means that they cannot sometimes talk openly and honestly and critically, particularly in any sort of public forum, about what the problems are. Rotary, which has done such brilliant work, they, for example, have to also, in addition to committing themselves to eradicate polio, they have to maintain a climate favorable to raising more funds from their members' activities. Very, very important. But it did cause a frisson of problem when the IMB first started meeting and issued its first report, which was very critical, in that Rotary headquarters, they told us, were bombarded with emails from around the world saying, who are these people and why are they saying the things that they say? And how do you expect us to raise money with these people there? Get rid of them. So there are tensions in any partnership, and it comes about from those conflicting objectives. Secondly, many global organizations have the features of a bureaucracy. Now, that's usually a negative term. I'm not using it in that sense. But I've worked in bureaucracies, and many of you will have, large organizations with complex structures. And there are some features of a bureaucracy that are not favorable to achieving change in a flexible and innovative way. First of all, they're often cautious. They fear failure. They welcome feedback on some things, but not others. They're less inclined to listen to dissenting voices. And sometimes it's the dissenting voices that are telling you something that you really need to know and act on. And they don't easily embrace innovation. We saw this morning Dr. Frieden's presentation, the comment about IPV. I won't go off on a sidetrack on that, but I think it is almost a case study in how a bureaucracy of bureaucracies cannot take a step which would have attached some risk to them by possibly undermining the philosophy of the polio vaccine and confusing the recipients of it, which was their opinion, and maybe offering a massive breakthrough. So it's an absolute classic example of how bureaucracies are risk-averse and are rather nervous about embracing innovation. The third thing about global programs is that they suffer from a democratic deficit. They are, to a certain extent, insulated from the sort of pressures that leaders in countries would experience. So, for example, on polio, there was no particular public outcry about the problem being there. Who is the public that would make such an outcry? And yet, if it was a problem of a different nature, and certainly if it was a problem within a country which people were dying from, a government would be under enormous pressure to be accountable for delivering a solution. That tends not to happen. Sometimes it does with crises like Ebola, but not generally with many of the problems that global health deals with. Secondly, there was no professional outrage about polio still existing. Most doctors I've talked to, and just anecdotally over the time I've been in this job, half of them thought polio was already eradicated, and some of them really didn't know what scale it was on, where it was, why it was a problem. And that's a key health profession that you would normally expect to be indignant about a problem that hadn't been solved. And then finally, there's no media scrutiny, or seldom any media scrutiny globally that bites. In my old position as Chief Medical Officer in the UK, I at times was under intense scrutiny for decisions that were taken, decisions that were not taken, and woe betide me if I held back on a decision and then it was shown that having taken that decision earlier would have saved lives. I would have been out of a job. But that sort of pressure is not there. The global health programs are often insulated for that. And then finally, there is usually no single person identified as being in charge or fully accountable for the program. The 5 points I wanted to make here, I've made the first one about partnerships, the second one was about the features of bureaucracies, the third one about the democratic deficit. The last two are briefer. First of all, another area of concern or dysfunction is that headquarters and field relationships are often dysfunctional. The relationship between the headquarters of a body and the people who are representing them at operational level often doesn't work very well or is in conflict. That's been true at times in the polio program. And then finally, and this is a really big bugbear of mine, appointments to key positions are not always made on merit. That's the polite way of putting it. Appointments to key positions are not usually made on merit. And that is something which I think has been a major difficulty for the polio program. So then, my next point is that in addition to those, if you like, generic problems of the design of global programs, the structure and function of global programs, of which polio is an example, but there are others as well. There were then some polio-specific characteristics which have been barriers to progress. And I'll run through these quite briefly. We started about 5 minutes late, so I'm giving myself those 5 minutes to stay on time. First of all, polio was not a priority in some of the countries affected. Now, that may seem a statement of the obvious, but it's actually very profound. At various times, those countries have not necessarily, health has not necessarily been a priority relative to other sectors of government. And then within health, there have been other disease problems that have been a greater priority than polio. So think about that. That is shaping the attitude of the governments in the affected countries, even on those very basic things about establishing a priority which they actually believe in their hearts, rather than just telling you, yes, we are giving a priority to it, what has been problematic. There's been a long-running tension in the public health world between those who believe in vertical programs and those who believe in routine immunization. And that's been a fault line which at various times has opened up more than it has for others. Now, the historians, or those who lived through some of the, who had cocktails on that day in 1977, may actually think, as some do, that the original intention of the polio eradication program was that it should be pursued, not through a vertical program, but polio should be eradicated as a byproduct of developing routine immunization. That is one version of history. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it is one version of history. So that vertical routine conflict has been a problem. The third point to make is that the rationale for eradicating polio, I don't think, certainly until relatively recently, had established itself in a compelling narrative. There wasn't any clear narrative, and if in any endeavor to achieve a big goal, you need an overarching narrative that everybody can speak to, everybody believes in, and is compelling and inspirational. And polio didn't have that. It wasn't going to succeed on a burden of disease basis, per se. A financial argument was boring. Where was the excitement? And where was the, I think it was Jim Collins, the management guru, that spoke of BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal. Well, polio eradication is a big, hairy, audacious goal, but it doesn't sound like that the way people speak about it, and it's certainly not a narrative that has penetrated widely. And as far as I can gather, there was no real effort put into global communication, regular global communication, which is very strange from my perspective, because you would have expected that to be in place. And then finally, the security situation was a development relatively late in the day. There was quite a long window during the flatlining period when, yes, there were occasional rumors and banning of vaccination, but nothing on the scale that we have seen for the last 5 or 6 years. And that has made it that much more difficult. I have said that I think the program is a lot better at getting access. The expertise in working around security situations is stronger than the expertise in management, which I believe is has been one of the weaker features of the program. That doesn't mean that security isn't still extremely important, and there have been many tragic losses of life. But on the other hand, we can't blame it all on security. We have to look also at the way the program is run and managed and politically led and politically aligned. So when I used to teach students about public health, I would always say to them, of all the public health interventions, vaccine is the simplest. Start with that and build your complexity around it. So if you lined people up in a room to get their envelope with their mission in, wouldn't you rather be handed the envelope with your mission being to resolve a problem by vaccination than guarantee that you would reduce childhood obesity? Think of the complexity of that. And yet, this really simple intervention, which doesn't even need a needle or any skilled health worker to deliver, has ended up being a geopolitical problem. At one level, it's fascinating. At another level, it sort of defies the usual laws of public health gravity, where if you've got a vaccine, you're opening the champagne thinking, right, we can solve the disease problem now. So I think my argument is that all global health programs need some element of external, independent judgment on what they do, and to help them to understand themselves. We've tried to do that for the program. We are not the heroes of the polio program. If it's eventually eradicated, that goes down, I think, to all the terribly tough jobs that people on the front line and those leading the teams do. They're the real heroes. But what we've tried to do in that old bit of management jargon is to add value here and there to improve things. So thanks for listening, and thanks for your support and interest in what we do.
Great. Well, that was fascinating. And so I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then we can open up to the audience. But you may have noticed that there's a report floating around that Chris and I wrote about the IMB, so that more of a deep dive into some of its processes and kind of looking at it as a fascinating, kind of unique way of doing monitoring and what the applicability of that might be to other global health programs. But the IMB reports are unique, and we started when we were reading them, and we found ourselves laughing out loud, which is not what usually happens when you're reading a monitoring report. So part of what I wanted to talk to you was it has a very distinctive voice. Where did that voice come from?
Well, we tried, I think, to be a voice of simplicity, to try and position ourselves so that we were explaining complex problems, complex solutions in a very simple way. I write a lot of the reports. I put a lot of my personal time into the reports. It's not done by a professional writer. My colleague Paul Rutter, who was the head of the Secretariat, does as well. The other IMB members have an input, but we want it to, you were laughing about the metaphors. We do throw metaphors in, I think, really just to try and capture people's attention. But we wanted our reports to be the sort of document that you would actually read from beginning to end. And most reports that are produced in the public health world are things that you dip into. You don't read it as there is no necessarily any core narrative. There are chapters, you dip into the bits you're interested in. But we wanted it to be, each time, a story that would have a beginning, a middle, and end.
And how did you, when you first took on this job and you envisioned this panel, how did it evolve? What changed in how you originally thought this was going to happen? I'm thinking about how do you explain this to another group that might come in and want to do something similar for another program?
Well, one of the areas I've worked in for quite a bit of my career is strategic management, and as far as I was concerned, as I explained in the presentation, the challenge was to understand why something wasn't working. And I think if that hadn't been the starting point for our work and we hadn't kept that groove of work and analysis, then I don't think we would have gone in the direction that we've gone. I mean, otherwise, I think we would have just been reiterating things that other people were saying, because the program itself produces assessments of its own performance. And they've changed their style a bit since we've started producing our reports, but essentially they were producing a lot of data, and people couldn't see the wood for the trees. Mm-hmm. And some of the techniques I developed I used to produce I was required in statutory terms when I was Chief Medical Officer in England for producing an annual report on the state of public health, it was called. And the first report was produced in 1858. I was the 15th Chief Medical Officer since that time, and the first one was appointed in response to the cholera outbreaks in Victorian England. And those early reports were light on data, but the data they had gave very deep insights. They didn't drown you in data, but also they were campaigning documents. And as a result, John Simone, who was the first Chief Medical Officer, introduced or was responsible for nearly all the sanitary reforms and the vaccine reforms. So it always appealed to me when I was producing reports that the report should have, they should galvanize people's attention. They should make their conclusions unambiguous, so you'd have to try very hard to disagree with them, and then they would give a clear path of action to address or resolve the problem. Now, in the IMB reports, we haven't always got there. Sometimes they've they've been too wordy. When the one area that I'm very passionate about, and I believe the program hasn't been passionate about, but I just haven't been able to get my point across, is the quality improvement, continuous quality improvement. And I've explained it in the reports, I've explained it to people face to face, and they give me a blank stare. And I'm absolutely convinced that if the ethos and the passion of continuous quality improvement was part of the program, we would have been there long ago. But it's a school of thought that not everybody adopts or believes in.
What do you think I'll ask one more question and I can open it up, but what do you think the biggest contributions have been of the IMB to global polio eradication?
I think walking around with a mirror and holding it up to people.
Are there specific changes that you've seen the program make as a result of IMB recommendations that you think were particularly constructive? Yeah,
I think we've probably, if you wanted me to pick two things, one was getting the program to recognize that the broad category of people factors were the most important thing. Whether it was nobody ever mentioned the vaccinators, ever. Well, I was never in a discussion initially when anybody talked about the position of the vaccinators. These were the people you were expecting to go out and negotiate with a reluctant mother to give the vaccine, go into dangerous areas, and they weren't discussed. Everybody knew that there were weak people in some of the key positions blocking progress. Nobody talked about that. Nobody talked about accountability. Nobody talked about training. So there were the people factors. And then I think the other thing that I hope we did was getting the driving metric to be missed children. I mean, it's always, you can't rely on a single metric, obviously, but most successful public health programs have one big number that everybody looks at first, and then there are other numbers that are relevant as well. And I think in one report, you quoted it in your review of what we did, we described it as a towering malevolent statistic. So that took a bit. I was sitting in the bath with some of my wife's bubble bath when she was out, and I thought of that turn of phrase. I rather like it. I do good thinking in the bath.
That's great. Okay, so I guess we have about 10 minutes. Do we have questions for Sir Liam? Robert? Can you wait for a microphone, please, and identify yourself?
Thank you. I'm Robert Steinglass, directing the Immunization Center at John Snow Incorporated, JSI. I've shared this comment with others in the past. It comes from the Jane's Defense Weekly. It's called incestuous amplification. And I think one of the problems with the polio community at the very beginning, in fact, up until maybe the establishment of the IMB, was the surrounding oneself with people who are only in agreement with yourself, sharing exact values, in lockstep agreement, sort of a mentality that doesn't invite perspectives contrary to that closed, insular society. And I think that's been one of the problems. I think it contributed to that long line that you were describing where there was so little action. And just one other comment is, if you go back to the 1988 resolution, it was very unambiguous. It said that polio should be eradicated in ways which strengthen national immunization programs and health infrastructure. So it was right there at the very beginning. To this day, the polio community still does not have any indicators that are used to measure, and they're not held accountable for that contribution, positive or negative, to the routine immunization program and health infrastructure. So my question is, what does it take with these global initiatives to have the kind of group that you've assembled, IMB, but sooner in the process? Does it always have to wait 20 years into an initiative before people recognize that there's a value of having an independent perspective? Thank you.
Well, I think on the second point, I think there would be value in trying to replicate the mechanisms that we use and the role that we play. As I indicated in the presentation, I think there are generic features to global health programs which mean it is difficult for them to judge themselves. I do, though, because not everybody gets this, I do feel very strongly that the perspective has to be of looking at the ways of working. You see, a lot of monitoring bodies set up would just look at the outcome and say, well, you're not doing very well, but they wouldn't try and understand the fundamentals of why you're not doing well. Coming back to quality improvement again, and probably the greatest exponent of that over time has been the Toyota Motor Company. And it said there, they have this stop the line philosophy. I'm sure you know that anybody can stop and then they solve the problem. But it said that they have to ask the question why on average 5 times before they get the answer, before they get to the truth and are able to solve the problem. So the challenge for me would be that if these bodies, if similar bodies were set up all over the world, would they approach it that way? And when I talk to people about the IMB role, that is the bit that they're least interested in. It's fascinating, but to me, that's at the heart of it. It's asking the 5 whys and then saying, well, this is not, what you're doing isn't fit for purpose. And so I think that's what we've done, and it may be that we're an oddity, that we disappear and nobody thinks of it again, because I don't think it's a function that people recognize as an auditing or monitoring function. So that would be what I'd say there. And then I think your point about the closed community, well, you're absolutely right, and I touched very lightly on that point when I was talking about bureaucracies, that not listening to dissenting voices. And when I was Chief Medical Officer in the UK, I always used to pull people like that in to my office and say, why are you saying what you're saying? Explain it to me. And 50% of the time they were right. There was something in what they were saying that needed to be looked at. But there was a terrible tendency in the civil service, which is where I was to deny, not like to hear bad news, have to go and tell the minister that his policy is not working. I mean, that's a terrible thing for a civil servant to have to do. Ends their career, sent, to Barnsley or some far corner of the UK to work after they told it. So the whole system of a bureaucracy tends towards lighting the blue touch paper and standing back, and if the firecracker doesn't go off, to pretend that it did go off. I'm mixing a nice lot of metaphors today.
Are there other questions? Henry? Oh, yep. We're coming.
So I have 2 questions. You started out your speech by very poignantly bringing up this tension between vertical and horizontal programs, and it's embedded in a lot of issues that flow around the polio eradication program. So given your background, where you come from, and your engagement with primary health care more broadly in England, I'm curious to see what your perspective is looking towards the future on how we might be able to diminish the natural tensions that are always there between vertical programming and horizontal strengthening, health system strengthening, building stronger primary health care programs, achieving health for all these great themes that have been a part of what we've been doing. So that's my first question. The second one is, might there be a role for your independent monitoring board in the future? This was mentioned earlier this morning in other ways to strengthen global health programming, but also I'm wondering if there might be a role for something like this within countries where there's such a great need to bring an authoritative voice to the shortcomings of government programs that affect the lives of people?
Yes, I think both are very good questions. I think the vertical horizontal, I mean, there are people who think that polio would have been eradicated more quickly if the original resolution had been pursued in the way that was intended. But of course, we all know that the strengthening of healthcare systems and the building of primary care is very difficult and at times vague. You know, people say, well, strengthen healthcare system, almost as if it's a mantra. But I think if enough ingenuity and creativity had gone into coming up with more practical ways of doing that earlier, I think we could have been further forward. But I would certainly be very dubious of entering into another vertical program like measles eradication, which didn't get delivered through strengthening routine immunization. What Dr. de Quadros called a banner disease, I think there are advantages to having that, but not if it then flips into a vertical program. It would be very interesting to understand exactly how we moved from that resolutions wording to the style of program that subsequently evolved. And the second point was about whether you could have IMBs within countries. It's a good idea, but talking truth to power within a country, within some countries, is very difficult. Very difficult for the people concerned. And so I think it might work in some places, but would not easily work in others.
Okay, I think, do we have time for one more? John, and then I think we have to wrap it up. Yeah, sorry, it's over here.
Thank you. Two points, or maybe three quickly. Being a Yogi Berra fan, but not a Yankee fan, I was delighted to hear you're quoting Yogi from a person coming from the other side of the lake. But I'd like to quote David Butler Jones, who was a former chief medical officer of Canada, who always said that public health is easy to get wrong. And I think that underlines all the points you made about external monitoring and that sort of accountability. I just finally would like to thank you personally, because there's not a day that goes by that I don't miss him, for discussing Cyril and the vision he had. He was quick to take leadership risks if it, in the end, would benefit the program. And asking Carl Taylor to evaluate polio's contribution to health systems was an incredible risk, because Carl, as you know, was into primary care, very much against the, quote, verticality that polio introduced. Now, the report wasn't glowing, but it did highlight some amazing contributions. So anyway, thank you, and what you do in your role. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to end, then I'll throw, if I can remember it, Yogi Berra back at you on your David Butler comment, which was one Yogi Berra quote that I took to heart when I was chief medical officer. I think anybody in a senior position would, which he said, when I'm right, no one remembers. When I'm wrong, no one forgets. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.